everyone, welcome back to Avodery. If you're new here, my name is Ines and I love to share all things natural parenting, sustainable living, and today we're talking about home birth. I have had 2 home births now, one 2 years ago and then one just at the beginning of January. So I've got a little bit of experience and lots of people have been asking me questions about it. So I thought today I would do a little Q&A answering all of the questions that people have been asking me. Before we dive in, I want to say that obviously birth is something that you need to give lots of thought to and make sure that whatever you choose to do is going to work for you. So I am by no means saying that home birth is right for everyone. There are definitely situations where it's worth considering whether you need to be in a hospital. I think those situations are probably less frequent than doctors would have us believe, but for sure it's always a good idea to discuss things with your doctor or with your midwife before you make any decisions. And above all, I would say that the best place for you to give birth is the place where you feel safest. So for lots of people that will be at home, but also for lots of others it will be a birth centre or on a labour ward. So the first question I got was, what were your main reasons for wanting a home birth? Obviously this is a personal question, the rest will be more general about home birth, but I wanted to answer this because I thought it would help to explain why people choose to have a home birth and what are some of the main reasons why you might want to consider it. So my first birth was quite difficult, traumatic some might say. I was in the birth centre, but for various reasons there was like a cascade of interventions and I ended up in the labour ward and then ultimately in theatre, and my first baby was born by forceps. Now I'm sure the doctors in that situation made the best calls that they could and I'm absolutely not holding it against them, but I do think that things might have gone differently had I been in a place where I felt safe and had I understood what to say yes and what to say no to and been able to advocate better for myself. Now it's difficult to say because first births are just different. It's almost always the case that a first birth is much harder than the subsequent ones. So who knows what would have happened. Our bodies are designed to seek privacy and comfort and safety when we go into labour to help the process flow freely and for your body to do what it needs to do. You need that safety and that privacy. And conversely, going into a bright, noisy, busy hospital ward is not going to necessarily be the best thing for your body to do that job, to let the oxytocin flow and to let the labour process progress naturally. Having said that, obviously like I said at the start, there are some circumstances where you'll need doctors nearby and that is absolutely fine. That's not your failure, that's just the way it will need to be. But if you have a completely straightforward pregnancy, there's no risk factors, you want to be at home, then that is going to be the best place for you to be to allow that natural process to take place. So it's actually safer to give birth at home if it's your second or later baby, just because the likelihood of interventions occurring when you're at home is much lower, precisely because you're in a safe environment where labour can flow naturally. So if you have had a straightforward pregnancy and you've got no risk factors, then giving birth at home is likely to be the safest place for you to be. The next question is, how did you prepare for it? I'd imagine this will be slightly different for different people, but for me it was a case of preparing things practically, so making sure that we had everything in the house that we would need. It's worth talking to your midwife if you're considering having a home birth about what you will need to have in the house, but generally speaking it's things like having lots of towels available to deal with the mess. Waterproof sheets are really invaluable, especially if you have carpeted floors like we do. Anything that you want to make labour comfortable and enjoyable for you, or as enjoyable as it can be. So that might be candles, nice music, low lighting, making sure that you've got the people around you that you would like to have. You might also want to consider having a pool. I had a pool the first time around, but actually wasn't, like, things went too fast to use it, and so the second time I had a home birth just recently, I actually decided to not bother with the pool at all. But if you want a pool, and lots of people do, then it's worth gathering all the things you need for your pool. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second because I had a question about a water birth and how to prepare for that. It's also worth packing a bag. So if you're having a hospital birth, then you'll be encouraged to pack a hospital bag. Obviously if you're planning a home birth, ideally you're not aiming to go to hospital, but there is always a chance that things will go wrong, or something will happen that will mean that you have to go into hospital. And so it can be really important to have a bag packed so that if you need to rush off to hospital, you've got everything in one place. And even if you don't end up at hospital, having everything in one bag is really handy, because it means that when you're in labour, you or your partner know exactly where to go to get the things that you'll need. I actually have a whole video about the hospital bag that I packed when I had Jessie in January, and I will link that up at the top so you can go and have a look at what I packed in that. Finally, the midwives will also do some prep. Sometimes they will bring a big box with supplies, so things like waterproof pads. They'll also have gas and air with them, so sometimes they deliver that ahead of time and sometimes they bring it when you go into labour. There are all sorts of things like that, and they will often have a big box that they deliver around 37 weeks, so it's all ready to go when you go into labour. The next question is, what do you need for a water birth and how to prepare? So like I said, I haven't actually ever had a water birth, but I did plan one the first time round. The first time I had a home birth, I planned a water birth. So I know roughly what you need to have. Again, I would chat to your midwife, because they will be able to say exactly what you need from their perspective. I'm sure different midwives work in different ways, so it's worth chatting to them. But broadly speaking, you'll need a pool. So it needs to be a proper birth pool, because they're bigger and taller than, like, say, a paddling pool, so that the baby is actually born into the water and not into the air and then hits the water, if that makes sense. So a proper birth pool is really important. You'll also need a liner for the pool. So often the pools are rented or come secondhand, so getting a liner is a way to obviously help keep the original pool underneath hygienic, ready for the next user or ready for the next time you choose to use it. Then things like a pump to blow it up, hose attachments to fill up the pool when you go into labour, and then again, like, large waterproof sheets to go underneath the pool so that you're protecting your floor. Everything except the pool needs to be brand new, and that's just because if you reuse things, obviously there's a risk of infection, and we just want to keep everything absolutely beautifully clean when there's a new baby arriving. So everything needs to be brand new, the liner, the pump, the hose, everything. The next person has asked, how did you find a midwife to assist? I'm not sure where this person is in the world. The question suggests to me that maybe they're in a part of the world that doesn't have a national health service. Here in the UK, we do have a national health service. My midwives just came through the national health service. You can obviously get an independent midwife, and some people choose to do that, particularly if they have strong feelings about the kind of midwife that they would like to be at their birth. But honestly, particularly with midwives at home births, I've found that they've been really well aligned to what I want and have understood really well the natural process of birth. In fact, that's true even of the ones that I had in hospital. I've never met a bad midwife, to be honest. They're all wonderful. If you hold certain beliefs about birth and you want to make sure that you've definitely got a midwife that's going to be on board with those, then looking for an independent one might be a good idea. But otherwise, I really rate the NHS. Who doesn't? It's wonderful. The next question is, did you use a doula? So if you don't know, a doula is a experienced lady who has been at lots of births and is trained to support you through the birth process. So they will do things like helping you to stay comfortable during birth. They will advocate and support you in your birth plan. Sometimes they'll help you with birth preparation, so perhaps with hypnobirthing courses or teaching you certain things that will help you deal with pain in labour. And I suppose just in general, a kind of safe presence that you will have got to know. And perhaps if you haven't got to know the midwives that are going to be at your birth, then you will know the doula, and there will be a bit of continuity, and hopefully you will feel a bit safer and more supported. Doulas are expensive, I suppose, would be a way to say it, because obviously you're asking someone to be on call, over the period that you could go into labour, and then potentially being there for quite a long time while you're actually in labour. But if you have had a difficult experience previously and you really want some support, or if you're a first-time mum or you've got certain risk factors but you still want to have a home birth, then having a doula could be a really useful thing, because they'd be able to help support you through that process and allow you to feel more confident with your decision. So yeah, I would have loved to have one. Financially speaking, it wasn't possible, but yeah, if that is an option for you, I would definitely recommend it. Lots of doulas actually will do options for people on lower incomes. So I know one doula that I know of who was a doula for a friend, she offers kind of reduced packages for lower amounts of money, if that makes sense. So perhaps she won't actually be there at the birth, but she'll do a few phone calls with you ahead of time to help you prepare, maybe talk through your questions and help you to be ready to have the kind of birth that you want to have. So that's definitely an option to look into if you don't have the full amount to spend on a doula to be at your birth. So the next question is, do you let the hospital, doctor or nurse know labour started, and are they on call for the duration? So I don't know about other parts of the world. This is my experience in the UK with the NHS. So in that situation, all of the same things that apply when you're calling the hospital to go into the hospital, if that makes sense. You would just call the midwife at exactly the same time, but instead of then yourself going to hospital, they will come to you. Are they on call for the duration? So if you mean, are they on call throughout the period that you might go into labour, then yes, there should always be someone from the home birth team on call. It wouldn't necessarily be the midwife that you saw for appointments, but often there's a team of like 5 or 6 midwives who are like obviously on rota, and then it's whoever is on call that day. So both times that I've had a home birth, the midwives that have turned up have been ones that I hadn't known as well, but they've always been wonderful. So it's been absolutely fine. Do they stay with you for the duration of your labour, I suppose is another way of looking at that question. For me, that's always been the case, but I've had quite short labours with my second and third children. So I'm not sure what the case would be if, for example, your labour went over 24 hours. I'd imagine that they, obviously they need to go home and shower and have a sleep and stuff. So I'd imagine that they do switch over after a certain amount of time, but I've personally never experienced that, so I'm not sure. I had lots of questions about siblings. So were older siblings around or not, and how was it? So with my first home birth, which was my second birth, so obviously I had a 2-year-old at the time. He is super active. He's still like that, very energetic, very bubbly, I suppose is the way to put it. And I didn't want him at my birth, which I love him to pieces, but I just felt like it was going to be difficult to kind of focus on giving birth. So with that, we made plans for him to be away from the house. So we called husband's mum, and she took him out of the house for the day when I went into labour with Margot. This time round we had the same plan. My second, the little girl that I gave birth to second time, she is much more relaxed, and probably now that I've done home birth once, I would have been okay with having the older 2 in the house with me. But as it happened, it was actually in the middle of the night and they were sleeping. So they were in the house, but they were asleep. So kind of an ideal situation in a way. We did have my mother-in-law in the house, so she was sleeping in the spare bedroom, and had it been in the day, she would have been, perhaps she would have taken them out, at least for parts of labour, and had the children woken up whilst I actually was in labour, she would have dealt with it. So I would recommend, if you can, having relatives in the house, or else arrangements to send your children away, just so that you're not having to think about those practicalities. But having said that, I know lots of people do have their children at their births and they absolutely love it. I think on the whole, I've heard that children deal really well with birth. They find it really interesting rather than scary. Yeah, it's certainly something worth considering. It's important not to see home birth as a way to solve childcare issues, because obviously there is always the chance that you will have to transfer to hospital, whether during labour or afterwards. So regardless of whether or not you're planning to have a home birth, it's always good to have someone on call to be able to help out, or at least arrangements for how you're gonna cope with having other children around if you have to transfer to hospital. Something worth bearing in mind. The next question is, how did you manage the what if something went wrong fear? Which is a great question, and one that I get an awful lot. Actually, it's probably the question I get the most about home birth. The way I would answer it is to go back to what I said right at the beginning of this video, which is that home birth is actually one of the safest ways to give birth, particularly if it's your second or later child and you've had a low risk pregnancy. Like I said, the process of birth is designed to happen somewhere safe and calm and private, and honestly, there's no better place for those things than your own home. So if you have no risk factors and it's going to be straightforward, then it's a no-brainer. If on the other hand you do have risk factors in your pregnancy, like perhaps you've got gestational diabetes or something like twins or a breech baby, it's still possible to have a home birth. And don't listen to anyone who tells you that it's not possible, because anything's possible as long as you're well prepared. So if you're in those situations and you're really set on a home birth, then raise it with your midwife. Make sure that you've asked lots of questions around, you know, what's going on and how they would deal with those things, and whether there are certain specialists around who could be there to support you with your birth that you're planning to have at home. In my second birth, I did actually have risk factors because I'd previously had quite a large blood loss. So after my first birth, I had a really heavy blood loss, and the doctors were quite worried about me having a home birth. But I knew, having done lots of research, that I was much less likely to have a blood loss at home than in another hospital birth. So I really pushed for it. But I also asked the midwives, you know, what measures were going to be in place to make sure that if that did happen, that I was staying safe and that the baby was staying safe. So they talked about the fact that they could give me the syntocin injection to help my uterus contract quickly and prevent blood loss being too heavy. They talked about, you know, what would happen, like who we would call, how long it would take to get to hospital, things like that, so that we knew that if that happened, exactly what was going to happen and what the risks were. And we decided that in that situation there wasn't too big a risk to me or to the baby if that did happen. In the end it didn't, wonderfully, so I'd like to think I was right. But yeah, it's worth asking and making sure that you are prepared for things that might come up. There are some basic factors as well that will help to allay your fears. So when I had a home birth the first time, I was only 5 minutes from the hospital. So my husband and I decided that, you know, it probably wouldn't take us much more time to get to a doctor than it would have done if we were in the birth centre. So all told, the risks were not that much higher. If you're half an hour away from the hospital and you have risk factors and so on and so forth, then maybe, you know, all of those factors together would push you more towards being in a birth centre or going into the hospital. But it will depend on your personal circumstances. So kind of related question here was, how close is a doctor if necessary, and would they be on hand, or would it be call 999? So it is call 999 if something happens in labour that means you have to go into hospital. They will always call 999, even if it's not particularly an emergency. So they'll call 999 if you have tearing that can't be stitched at home, which I think is kind of crazy, but nevertheless, that's the way it is. So no, there's no doctor on call. You just need to be prepared to call an ambulance if it's needed. But obviously your midwives would help you with that if that situation arose. This person has asked for my top 5 tips for partners to support a home birth. I'm not sure I have 5 tips. I wish I did. A lot of my tips would be the same as tips for hospital birth. So things like getting your birth partner to know your birth plan really well, to be prepared to advocate for it, being ready to listen to you and support you in labour, and sort of putting you first. Practically speaking, for a home birth, it's worth doing test runs for things like inflating a pool, or, you know, making sure that they know the numbers to call when the midwives need to come. One thing I would say is to get them really comfortable with the process and ask any questions that they have directly to your midwife. So like I mentioned earlier, with my second birth, we were worried about blood loss because that had occurred previously, and my husband was a bit anxious about it. So he actually came along to one of my appointments with my midwife and asked those questions directly to her, so that he knew exactly what would happen and what the risks were of us having a home birth, with that being a possibility. And that was able to allay his fears, which then helped him to feel more comfortable during the actual labour itself. Nothing is going to be worse than having a partner who is anxious, so they need to feel comfortable about the process as well, so that they're not stressing and kind of putting anxiety on the whole process. The next question is about pain relief. So what did you use to manage pain? For me personally, I with both of my home births, I didn't really have any pain relief. I used a TENS machine, which, if you don't know, is a little machine that sends kind of electrical impulses through your skin and just helps you be distracted from the pain of the contractions. In both cases, I found it useful, but not essential, so that's something worth considering. For a home birth, midwives do bring gas and air with them. So if you want gas and air at home, that is a possibility. Some midwives will also bring like a pethidine injection. I think pethidine is an opiate. So that's a nice heavy pain relief, particularly if you need to get some sleep. So that's worth chatting to your midwife about. The next question is wonderful. Did your neighbours realise you had given birth? No, they didn't. Our neighbours in one direction were on holiday because it was Christmas, and the neighbours in the other direction, I actually asked them and they did not hear me. So there you go. What happens right after the birth at home? How are the first few hours? This, I think, is one of my favourite things about home birth, the bit after the labour. There's nothing better than recovering from birth in your own home. So both times we have had quite straightforward, a couple of hours after birth, and then just been in our own bed that night, which is really precious. Having said that, I think this is one of the things that people worry most about with home birth, because they think that they're going to have to do lots of cleanup, maybe there's going to be mess everywhere, and it's going to be really stressful. That has not been my experience either time. The midwives and your partner will help you to get comfortable, to have some skin to skin with your baby, and then they will clean up around you. So both times I've had a home birth, the midwives have done a lot of the cleanup, and then my husband has helped as well, just chucking towels in the washing machine, bundling up anything that needs to go straight in the bin. In an ideal world, you've laid out a lovely area of waterproof sheets and towels during the birth. With both of mine, the midwives have done that for me, so I've been focusing on labour and they've been preparing the floor underneath with towels and waterproof sheets. So at the end, it's just a case of kind of bundling it all up and chucking it in the washing machine or throwing it away, depending on what you want to do with it all. So it's actually much less stressful than people think. I've never personally found I've even had to lift a finger, which I think is the way it should be when you've just given birth to a baby. So don't worry about that. Obviously, if you have a pool, the cleanup will be a little bit more complicated because you'll have to empty the pool. Again, I think some midwives will help you do that, others maybe won't. I would think that more would, but I'm not sure, I don't want to promise. You will need to have a plan for emptying the pool, so yeah, just have that in mind, and as long as they or your partner know what they're doing with it, then they will deal with all of it, and again, you shouldn't have to lift a finger. After all the cleanup is done and you've had your lovely golden hour of skin to skin, they'll do all the normal checks that they would do in hospital. They'll also check you, so check for tearing particularly, and both times I have torn but been able to have stitches at home, so haven't had to transfer to hospital. But if you do have particularly bad tearing, then they might ask you to go to hospital to have that stitched up if they're not able to do that at home. So assuming all of that is okay, the midwives will leave within a couple of hours of you having given birth, leave you to it to rest and relax in your own home. So after I had Margot, my first home birth, we ordered a pizza, watched TV for a couple of hours, and then went to bed. It's really precious to be in your own space when you've just given birth. If you have any more questions about home birth, do drop them in the comments and I will try and answer them for you there. Or you can head over to Instagram, where I regularly do little Q&As and might do one on home birth in the future, so that you can ask your question then. Otherwise, I hope that's been helpful, and I really hope that you will consider home birth if it's right for you. I think it is wonderful, and I will definitely do it again if I have another baby. Okay, I think that's everything, so I'll see you all next time. Bye.